Please be aware that this episode includes descriptions of domestic violence.
We share these streets, true tales of everyday folk in bygone Nottingham. Episode 9. Leah. Nottingham has always been a melting pot where people of different creeds, backgrounds and ethnicities mix relatively peacefully. It might be our location at the heart of England that's appealing, since when you're in the middle, you're not too far from anywhere else. The popular legend has it that Germanic Saxon settlers were based around the modern Lace Market area, whilst Normans or French were based around Castle Rock, though they mingled in a market where the old market square is now. In the modern era, we're a mix of locals and students, and mingle anywhere from shops to pubs, when mingling is permitted, of course. Many students become locals by choosing to stay in the city after studying, and further add to the richness of our population. In the late Victorian times, people flocked to Nottingham to work in the city's thriving textiles industry. Magazine articles and publicity of the day referred to Nottingham as Laceopolis, in reference to the huge wealth that lace manufacturing was generating. With the city thriving, it was natural that workers would be drawn here. John and Martha made an epic journey from Chard in Somerset in 1879. It's about 180 miles between the two locations, and in the 1870s would not have been a comfortable journey. It's likely at that time they would have arrived by train, probably via Bristol, and would likely have arrived at the old Midland station. The train station we know today wasn't built until 1904, and since 1848 Midland Station had its entrance on Station Street, opposite the gap between Loxley House and Trent House in 2021. After arriving in Nottingham, John and Martha had a daughter named Leah on the 22nd of November 1879. So 1879 was busy for them. They married, moved to Nottingham and had a baby in the same year. We don't know for sure, but that timeline suggests that perhaps their relationship may have been quite controversial and scandalous back home, and they were perhaps looking for a fresh start where nobody knew them. On the 1881 census, John was listed as a lace worker, and the family were living at 2 Courtenay Terrace on Westville Street in St Anne's. St Anne's of yesteryear had a different layout to the St Anne's we know today, but confusingly many of the modern street names echo previous street names that were situated nearby. Courtenay Terrace may have been around the modern Broadoaks building and just east of Courtenay Gardens in St Anne's. 10 years later, the 1891 census has both John and Martha listed as lace workers and living at 11 Glenroy Terrace, Manning Street, St Anne's. Glenroy Terrace was between Robin Hood's Chase and Looping Close. Leah was 19 years old when she married a baker named George, who was 24, on June the 17th, 1899 at St Anne's Church. St Anne's Church is long gone, but was central to the lives of St Anne's population. It was consecrated in 1864 and demolished in 1971 as part of St Anne's wholesale redevelopment. In 2021 there's a post office on St Answell Road. The large open concrete space in front of the post office is the site that used to be occupied by a lot of the church. Among the trustees who financed St Anne's Church was famed lace manufacturer Thomas Adams, whose Adams building still sits on Stony Street in the Lace Market. The church was designed by Robert Clark, who designed a number of other beautiful buildings that you can still see in Nottingham streets. At the time of their wedding, Leah was listed as living with her parents at 19 Bloomfield Street, which was between modern Tulip Avenue and Hungerhill Road, and George at 51 Gawthorne Street, New Basford. Unlike St Anne's, New Basford hasn't changed an awful lot over the decades, and 51 Gawthorne Street in 2021 is the same building that George occupied. Leah and George had a daughter named Doris the same year, on November the 5th, 1899. 3 years later there was another census, and in 1901 we found George still listed as a baker and the family living at 3 Cliff Terrace on Manning Street in St Anne's. Part of Manning Street still exists, but in days gone by was longer, and we weren't able to trace the exact location of Cliff Terrace. Official records showing things like birth, marriages and address details are vital to research but don't tell a whole story. On Thursday the 23rd of January 1902, the Nottingham Daily Express featured a small article entitled "A Husband's Neglect." The article states that Leah was living apart from George and had summoned him, accusing him of willfully neglecting to provide for her. She accused him of doing no regular work. George had apparently told her that he'd been so long out of work that he felt he wouldn't gain a position now. In the summer of 1901 he'd played cricket professionally and earned £1 per week, which was the equivalent of around £130 per week at the time of recording. He allowed Leah 3 shillings of this, around £11 or 8% of the weekly household income. Due to the financial difficulty her husband imposed on her, Leah had gone to live with her parents. At the hearing, George was ordered to pay 6 shillings per week to Leah. On a national level, Britain had entered the Edwardian era by this time. Differing perceptions exist of the country's time under King Edward VII. A positive interpretation would say that this was a golden era of parasols, straw hats and garden parties, whilst a more critical view might suggest that at this time Britain lazily rested on its laurels and failed to match the innovation of the Victorian era. These views are oversimplifications, of course. Somebody who hadn't spent the era at a garden party lounging idyllically under a parasol was Leah. The 1911 census shows that she worked in textiles as a plain net maker. She lived with daughter Doris at 11 Manning Street. George, meanwhile, is still listed as a baker but now boarded at 62 Gawthorne Street, a few doors from his previous listed address. Again, although the official records hint at discord and domestic problems, they don't come close to fully telling Leah's tale. On the 7th of March 1913, Leah filed for divorce. Her petition is a detailed and sickening catalogue of domestic abuse inflicted upon her by George over the course of their relationship. George had struck her in the face and given her black eyes, caught her in the face, cutting and bruising her, beat her about the body with his fists, and tried to strangle her, frequently abused her verbally, punched her body and head and threw her against a wall, thrown hot cocoa over Leah and smashed her head against a wall, picked her up and went to throw her down some cellar steps. George frequently kept her without sufficient food, great unkindness and cruelty, banged her head against a bedpost. George cohabited and habitually committed adultery with a local woman named Maud. The petition requested the marriage be dissolved and Leah be granted custody of Doris. George is listed as living at 32 Falcon Grove, Sherwood Rise, which is another of his old haunts that survives today. It's positioned to the rear of the Sherwood Rise Medical Centre. George was with his mistress, Maud, at Falcon Grove when the divorce papers were served. George didn't bother contesting Leah's claims. The divorce was formally granted in London on Friday, June the 26th, 1914. Understandably, custody of the couple's daughter Doris, then 14 years old, was also granted to Leah. In 1916, George married Maud. We didn't investigate whether he was any less violent and abusive with her as he was with Leah. Leah herself went on to marry widower Richard in the same year. Richard lived on Bloomfield Street at number 24, on the opposite side of the road to Leah's dad. His wife Eliza had passed away in 1907. In days gone by there was much more social interaction between neighbours, and I feel sure Richard and Leah would have been familiar with one another for years before getting together. Leah moved into number 24 after they married. The site of 24 Bloomfield Street in 2021 straddles portions of the front gardens of 52, 54 and 56 Hunger Hill Road. In 1922, Leah and George's daughter Doris passed away, aged 23. In 1939, John, Leah's father, passed away. It had been 6 decades since he and his wife Martha had made the move from Somerset. If the duo had come to Nottingham to improve their prospects financially, they seem to have succeeded. Leah inherited the equivalent of between £18,000 and £19,000 when he died. Leah was born in the Victorian age and passed away in the rock and roll era in 1955. How the world had changed in that time, especially for women. Leah was decades ahead of her time in terms of her attitude. In an era where women were frequently only permitted to speak when invited by a man, she simply didn't accept the cruel abuse that George seemed to think he could inflict upon her. She strove for a better life for Doris and herself, and ultimately achieved it. It's a modern mantra that there are circumstances in life that you can control, and there are others that you can't. Leah seems to have been well ahead of her time by finding the strength to improve the circumstances under her control. Leah is buried with her husband Richard and dad John at Wilford Hill. I'm very proud to say that Leah is my great-great-aunt. Now that I know her story, I find myself reflecting on times in my life or those of my family where we've faced bullying or adversity, and I think I can see flashes of Leah's strength and defiance in our responses. God bless you, Auntie Leah.